All right, teachers, another outside video on a Friday. Sorry that I can't get it to you sooner, but life gets busy, ministry gets busy. But we are in Joshua chapter 6, verses 12 through 25 this week. And key thought regarding God's strategy, which is the name of the lesson. A great strategy is only as effective if it is believed in and properly implemented. You can have the greatest strategy of all, but if the people don't listen to it and buy in this case, obey, which they did, it's not going to work. So, the Bible has tons of strategies, if you will, for us to live effectively for Christ, but we've got to do our part. So in our passage, we see the people of Israel and Joshua doing that. So just like the last lesson, the first 11 verses, the context leading into our passage are the instructions, and then we are studying the implication, or the implementing, the obedience. Another overall lesson, probably the overall lesson, is God's unusual ways force us to trust Him and display all His power, all His power is at work, not ours. God doesn't need us. He uses us by His grace, but He doesn't need us. God didn't need any of Israel's warriors. He never needed them, even though often they'd go to battle, but He would fight for them. And we certainly see this here. Just a little context, the size of Jericho, archaeologists say it was approximately 10 acres. So it's pretty small. It normally would hold about 1,200 people. But it was extremely well fortified, as it was the first city you would come to if you were able to cross the Jordan. And scholars assume, based on the scriptural evidence, that the Canaanites all knew about Israel. They were starting to fear what these people were going to do to them. We see that right here in the book of Joshua. We'll reference that in just a minute, that verse. Their hearts were melting. So it's very probable, scholars believe, that a couple thousand more people from the surrounding cities would have kind of fled into Jericho to escape the wrath, if you will, of these people and their God. So it could have been several thousand people in Jericho at this time. But if it was up to Joshua or any other person in human wisdom, how would you conquer a fortified city? A city with huge walls. And generally speaking, as you look at even the Old Testament and how often especially the pagan nations would deal with cities like this, they would lay a siege and they would just kind of wait out the people. Or maybe they could scale the walls. Based on the way Jericho was fortified, which I don't have time to explain, you probably couldn't shoot arrows over the walls and make any difference. They're very high walls. There was a pretty good distance between the initial wall, the main wall, and the houses that are built along the wall. They were built along the inner wall, kind of a retaining wall. But notice that God, of course, always has a different plan, and His reason would be found in chapter 4, verse 24, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So both for the Israelites and for the nations, this message was being sent. And this is still the reason why God puts challenging circumstances in our lives and asks His people to do hard things and to encounter things and deal with things that seem impossible, and sometimes ask us to do things that just don't seem to make sense to us, but we know He's kind of leading us there. And that is because God chooses the foolish of this world, both in people and even in this case in strategies, what would seem foolish and what would be foolish if it wasn't for the power of God, in order to confound the wise. And that's what God is doing. He's trying to confound these pagan nations and show them that their gods are not gods at all, and that only the true God of Israel, the God of Israel, is the true God. So verse 1, just some context. The first 11 verses are important context. Jericho is shut up inside and out. And we usually think of that expression as saying, well, that's emphasizing that this is a fortified city. That's really not what's being emphasized here. What's being emphasized is the people in Jericho are terrified, and they've locked their doors, and they are inside that city hoping to survive. Matter of fact, chapter 5, verse 1 says, as soon as all the kings of the Amorites who are beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So they've locked themselves in. And scholars also say that because the harvest had just passed, remember the water was overflowing because of the harvest season, the inhabitants of Jericho had enough food inside their city, and they had plenty of water. They had a huge, great freshwater spring inside the city walls that they probably could have withstood a siege for, some scholars say, up to 2 years. I don't know if that's true, but it's just a good information to understand that what God did may have seemed foolish, but it was probably the only way Israelites could have had the victory they did. Again, notice the centrality of the ark. We often talk about it being a symbol of God's presence, and while that is true, I think that's not enough. I think it's more than that. It in some way contained God's presence. Now, God is omnipresent. I understand that. Nothing can contain him, but at the same time, Scripture is very clear that he would dwell with his people in a very special way in the ark, and later in the temple in the Holy of Holies. The Shekinah glory, it's called, would be there. In other words, if you touch the ark, as Uzziah, I think that was his name, did, you'd die. If you went into the Holy of Holies and you weren't the high priest on the Day of Atonement, you would die. Why? Because you're entering into the presence of God uninvited and unprotected. Moses was protected when he went into the presence of God in the Mount Sinai, where God basically would only kind of in some way veil his glory, show him his backside, if you will. Remember when the ark was in the land of the Philistines, their idols toppled over. Their priests were infected by powerful boils and sores. Why? Because this isn't just a symbol. God's presence is dwelling inside the ark. And it wasn't a magic voodoo thing, as the world would say it was, but it was the vessel that God dwelt in a special way. So what's the message of the centrality of the ark? Well, the message is God's with them. God's going to fight their battles. He didn't need their army. He didn't need anything. He could do however he wanted to, and all they had to do was trust him and obey. Moving on, there's lots of sevens here. They had to go around for 7 days. The seventh day they went 7 times. There were 7 trumpets. Yes, 7 is an important number, day of number of perfection, but I think there's some practical things going on here. To do this for 7 days, to make them walk around the city for 7 days, doing nothing, not shouting, just blowing trumpets, God's testing them. Will they obey this command that doesn't seem to make sense? And will they get impatient and go ahead of things and try to conquer this city on their own, ahead of things? I wonder if some of them thought, why are we doing this for 7 days? Let's go, God. Don't you get tired? We get tired of waiting on God. I bet they got tired. Also, the inhabitants would hear the trumpets blowing every day, and that would just continue to add to their fear, kind of that expectation, when is the axe going to fall, if you will. And for application, our entire lives are a waiting period. Not a passive waiting period, because we have work to do. We have to trust Christ and obey Christ and serve Christ. But it's a waiting period until our ultimate victory, which won't come until we are with the Lord, whether that comes through our death and resurrection or whether it comes through the rapture. So we also have to be patient. Scripture constantly implores us to wait on the Lord. But it's not a passive wait, just as theirs was not passive. They had instructions and they had to obey them. Verse 17 and 22 through 25, we see the difficult for us as human beings to understand command to destroy and annihilate not just the people, not just the men, but the women and the children, all of them. This is often used by critics to denounce Scripture, to denounce God. How do you answer? How do your people answer the argument that a loving God would never do this to innocent people? This is a really important question that you need to be able to answer. They won't like your answer, but you need to have an answer. And so here are three aspects, and perhaps there's other things. But first of all, God's holiness and God's love are equal and full, and they don't contradict one another. So even when we're confused about something, we got to just settle on the fact that God knows better than us. He's not being unjust. He's not being unloving. Now, secondly, he's not being unjust because there are no innocent people in this world. You say, oh, but what about children and women? Well, these are pagan women and these are pagan children that would grow up to be a thorn in Israel's side and corrupt them, just as we see women and adults, but especially women, pagan women, corrupting God's people. Solomon, for example, and they would lead his many wives, led them into idolatry. Imagine if they didn't kill the children and they grew up and they know what happened to their parents. They know what happened to their town, everything. And many of them would rebel and become an enemy from within. And yet, we see God's love in the sense that he saves Rahab, who believed in God. You know something? Every citizen of Jericho had the same information Rahab did, but Rahab believed in the God of Israel. She submitted to the God of Israel, and God saved her and all of her family. So we see God's holiness and grace in action. And remember, grace is undeserved favor. Nobody deserves God's favor. Nobody deserves life, physically or spiritually. So the idea that God's doing something evil to people, we're just the clay, and God can do whatever he wants. He's God, and we don't deserve life. It's a gift. And so I think Christians, talk about grace all the time in relationship to salvation, but don't really always fully grasp what that truth, how that helps us in understand God and understand what happens to us and not questioning God, because everything we have, all that we are, is a gift of God. It's grace. And the criticism against God being unloving, again, assumes man's goodness, which man is not good, and man's entitlement of life and health and protection, instead of seeing those things as gifts that we don't deserve. So other than what I've already shared, what are some ultimate lessons and applications for us today? Number one, we serve the same all-powerful God. Number two, a life of faith requires viewing obstacles as opportunities to see God work as we trust him and obey him. And then the importance of being set apart from sin and worldly influence. That's why God is cleansing the land of these inhabitants. And that's why Joshua and the Israelites had to be faithful in doing that. Well, I hope all this helps you, and I hope to see all of you on Sunday. And I hope to see you at breakfast as well as connect groups and church.